Sure. Yeah. Okay, we're going to get started here. So let's all get our seats. And does anyone have any questions real quick before he gets started that we didn't ask? Going once? Going twice? Okay, just a second, Don. Let me bring this over to you.
I'm holding it close, and is it?
I'm sorry, it's not audible.
Nothing. Hello?
Oh,
There we go.
I think that's right.
Okay. Once again, we have Isaac and his wife who has twins, and she receives the message that the older is going to serve the younger. And then we have this whole fallout for the blessing and the birthright that seems to have gone throughout history as being an issue. Was it intended that Jacob should receive the birthright? Was it intended that he should receive the blessing? Was that God's intent, or was this just their proactive trying to fulfill God's purpose?
Okay, that's an excellent question, and there are undoubtedly a number of facets here. With respect to the birthright, ultimately, I'll say it was a question of free will. Whose free will? Esau's free will. That is, the implication of the text, by employing the past tense with respect to Jacob giving Esau the bowl of lentil soup, is he already gave it to him. And the selling of the birthright was something that Esau did of his own free volition because, as he expresses it, I'm going to die, what do I need it for? And moreover, the text clearly implies, by stating that Esau ate and drank and got up and left and disdained the birthright, that it was his attitude of disdain that resulted in his forfeiture of the birthright. Now that's with respect to the birthright. With respect to the blessings, there's an additional dimension that obviously needs to be taken into consideration. On the most basic plane, what did Isaac have in mind? And to answer that question, we need to consider carefully all of the blessings that we read in Genesis chapter 26 and chapter 27. Excuse me, chapter 27 and chapter 28 in particular, because it also continues into chapter 28. And how many blessings indeed are there that Isaac is dispensing? Well, let's list them. First blessing, the blessing that Isaac gave to Jacob, thinking it was Esau. Second blessing, the blessing that Isaac gave Esau, knowing that it was Esau. Is there another blessing? Is there another blessing? You betcha there is. What's the other blessing? The blessing that Isaac gave Jacob, knowing it was Jacob. Exactly. The blessing that we read at the beginning of Genesis chapter 28. And what is so significant about considering these three blessings is, so the blessing that Isaac gave Jacob thinking it was Esau. Anything spiritual in that blessing? Well, let's read. Sorry? But altogether, just to consider, no, there's Elohim is mentioned. But the content of that blessing, we read it inside, is may God give you of the dew of the heavens and of the fat of the earth and a multitude of grain and of wine. May nations, peoples serve you. May nations bow down to you. May you be the prince of your brothers, and may the children of your mother bow down to you. Those who curse you will be accursed, and those who bless you, blessed. Anything spiritual? This is a blessing of material bounty, exclusively so. What about the blessing that Isaac gave to Esau, knowing it was Esau? Let's read that blessing. Behold, of the fat places of the earth shall your dwelling be, and of the dew of the heavens above, and upon your sword you shall live, and your brother you shall serve, and it shall be when you subjugate yourself, you will cast off his yoke from upon your neck. Anything spiritual there? Not at all. Completely material. So Isaac doesn't have any spiritual blessings to bestow? Answer, of course he does. What's the final blessing that is bestowed by Isaac? In chapter 28. May God Almighty bless you and multiply you and increase you, that you will become an assembly of peoples. And may he give you the blessing of Abraham to you and your seed with you, to inherit the land of your sojournings, which God gave Abraham. Spiritual blessing there? That's entirely a spiritual blessing. First of all, it is only here and nowhere else that Isaac speaks of the blessing of Abraham. The blessing of Abraham is the spiritual legacy of Abraham. Second of all, another crucially important motif that appears concomitant with that appears only here and nowhere else, and that is the land. The land of your sojournings, the land of Israel. The land of Israel is, on the one hand, a material land, but not really. The land of Israel, far beyond its material substance, is a spiritual destiny. It is precisely in that vein that, from the get-go, the land of Israel plays so central a role in God's blessings to both Abraham and Isaac, and later on, of course, also to Jacob. That's the spiritual blessing. In other words, Isaac knew who Esau was. Isaac never entertained the thought of bestowing a spiritual blessing upon Esau. From the get-go, that was intended for Jacob. The blessing that he gives to Jacob, knowing it's Jacob, is entirely a spiritual blessing. It is when he thinks he's blessing Esau that he gives Jacob a material blessing. And of course, likewise, when he actually blesses Esau knowing it's Esau. The spiritual blessing was always vouchsafed for Jacob. So, what was the dispute between Isaac and Rebekah? And of course, upon reflection, the answer becomes obvious. It wasn't who was going to be the spiritual heir of Abraham and Isaac. It was who was going to receive the blessing of material bounty. And this is an idea that I heard very, very many years ago when I was a youngster from the rabbi of the synagogue of my youth, that it was on this bone of contention that they dissented. Rebekah posited the spiritual heir also needs to be the material heir. And Isaac should bestow the material bounty upon Jacob as well. So she specifically wanted Jacob to receive the blessing that was intended for Esau. She knew he would receive the blessing that was intended for him. Isaac dissented. Isaac felt that material bounty was liable to be a distraction and a liability from the spiritual mission with which Jacob is going to be saddled by the blessing of Abraham that will go specifically and exclusively to him. So they had this dispute, and Rebecca got the upper hand. And what is Isaac's response when he realizes he had been tricked? What does he say? No, he doesn't. He says, Gam Baruch Yihyeh. Indeed, he is blessed. Which could be understood on either of two planes. Either, Isaac was a prophet. He may have just sensed that the blessing that he gave Jacob, even though it was on false pretenses, stuck. He sensed he is indeed blessed. They could also be saying, okay, I saw things differently. Rebecca got the upper hand. Let's try her way. Let him indeed be blessed. And then, of course, inevitably the question is, so who was right? And the answer is both. Or it depends. There were times when indeed being the heir of great material bounty served in a salutary role to actualizing a spiritual potential. Unfortunately, there were also times when material bounty was an impediment to advancing spiritually. So, of course, ultimately it depends. And to that extent, we continue to appreciate that material bounty is only means to an end, and only means to that end when we use it appropriately. So that on the one hand is undoubtedly the answer with respect to the course of the blessing. As for what God had in mind, well, we don't really know, but we can see both aspects, if you will. But what I also feel compelled to add, on a much more sobering and even somber note, is what happens after Jacob gets the blessing? He essentially goes into exile for 22 years. And the Midrash conflates Jacob going into exile for those 22 years with someone else, as prescribed in the laws of the Torah, who goes into exile, namely the unintentional murderer. The unintentional murderer, after all, has to leave his home and go off to one of the cities of refuge where he has to stay until the death of the high priest. Now, it's important to stress, this is not merely for his protection, even though, of course, it is. It is to atone for the sin of taking another life because of lack of caution. In other words, the inadvertent sinner needs atonement for having inadvertently taken that life. And of what relevance is that to Jacob? Because in some sense, Jacob did the same thing. Meaning, it was inadvertent. He wasn't doing it deliberately. And he was only obeying what his mother told him to do. But, that marked the spiritual death of Esau. From then on, his attitude is, I want to kill Jacob. I have all these spiritual problems in terms of being a servant of the Lord, but you know what? It doesn't matter. I'll just kill Jacob and everything will be fine. And the moment he does that, he dies spiritually. And on some plane, Jacob is responsible. So Jacob needs to go into exile. And we'll note further that for the rest of Jacob's life, he keeps on being the victim of deceit. Laban deceives him, in some sense, because Leah and Rachel could have prevented the subterfuge. They deceived him. Obviously, his sons deceive him with respect to what happened to Joseph. And throughout, one gets the sense that, well, the payback that Jacob is getting for that act of deception is just colossal, indicating that as we noted in a different context earlier, we don't know what the divine judgment is in its detail, but we certainly appreciate that God carries his ledgers and he balances his books.
The lentils, the death of
Well, it doesn't. Of course, it doesn't say in the text. The Midrash conflates the circumstance of the lentil soup with the death of Abraham. Why? Because that it protected Abraham and enabled, ironically, the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. You will be ingathered to your forefathers in peace and be buried in a good old age. A good old age is to leave this world before Esau showed his true colors and said, I'm not interested in birthright, get me out of here. So before Esau went off the tracks, Abraham left this world. And this is
fascinating that Esau had a family and kids, and he rejected it, but Jacob didn't have any yet.
What do you mean he rejected his family and kids?
Esau had been married.
He married at age 40.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And he lists some of his kids. And yet he rejected the birthright, and Jacob, who's
I rejected the birthright. I'm sorry. I thought you said he rejected the kids. Okay, right.
No,
Right.
I think it's amazing that here a father who has a family doesn't want the birthright passed on, and Jacob is single.
Well, the premise of the birthright in our tradition is, remember, up until the sin of the golden calf, presumptively, it was the firstborn who was the family priest. That every family had its own family priest. That was the firstborn son. And to that extent, the role of being considered firstborn was a spiritual one. Jacob is interested in being involved in spirituality. Esau simply is not. Okay, anyone else? Anything else? Okay, so we move on to, yes. Where's the lamb? See, I need to know that when one looks at the Hebrew, one sees an additional dimension that doesn't carry through in the English. That is, when in Genesis chapter 22, they're on their way by themselves after parting ways with the youths who stayed behind. We read in verse 6, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it upon Isaac his son, and took in his hand the fire and the knife. Vayelchu shnehem yachdav, and the two went together. Now, I should note here, we aren't told how old Isaac is in the story. The Midrashic tradition conflates the age of Isaac at this juncture with the death of Sarah that is described immediately afterward at the beginning of Genesis chapter 23. By simple arithmetic, if Sarah dies at the age of 127, when she gave birth to Isaac at the age of 90, that means that Isaac at the time of this episode was 37 years old. contrary to Rembrandt. That is, if anything, Abraham is this relatively old and decrepit 137-year-old, and Isaac is a strapping man of 37. Certainly, it wasn't that Abraham somehow overpowered Isaac and put him on the altar. Rather, after we read in verse 6, the two went together. Isaac said to Abraham his father, saying, "My father." And Abraham says, "Here I am, my son. Behold the fire and the wood. Where's the lamb for the offering?" Now, in the Hebrew, Vayomer Abraham, Abraham said, I'm going to punctuate the verse according to the extraordinarily complex system of punctuation that is the cantillation points that tell us how to sing, not read, how to sing the text. Because, we Jews never read the Bible as a prose reading. We always sing it. And Abraham's response, based upon the punctuation of the melody, is, God will see for him a lamb for burnt offering, my son. And you sense the built-in double entendre. You could hear, God will see for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. But the truth is that the cantillation points would indicate God will see for himself the lamb, comma, for the burnt offering, my son. In other words, Abraham was already intimating to Isaac what the answer to his question was, what the real answer to his question was. God will see to him a burnt offering, my son. My son is the burnt offering. And the three-word conclusion of the verse in verse 8 is identical to the three-word conclusion of verse 6. The two went together. In other words, in verse 6, Abraham already knows where he's going. Isaac does not. But Abraham is in the same spirit, without any sense of foreboding and doom, as is Isaac. And in verse 8, when Isaac knows too, he's still walking with the same sense of purpose and dedication, without foreboding and doom, as his father Abraham. So there is undoubtedly that dimension of considering deeply the extent to which it isn't about Abraham imposing himself upon Isaac, but indeed the two going together. But now there's an additional dimension I feel compelled to add here, even though it's not directly the question, but nonetheless I think it's critical. In our tradition, we refer to this episode as Akedat Yitzchak, translation, the binding of Isaac. Not the trial of Abraham, even though formally that's what it was, but rather the binding of Isaac. To be even more precise here, Akedah literally means that hands and feet are bound together. In other words, that Isaac isn't able to move a limb. Why is that the most significant aspect of the episode to lend its name to the title associated with that episode for thousands of years? And on some plane, the answer in our tradition is because Isaac was concerned, especially given the disparity in age and undoubtedly physical condition between him and Abraham, that he might reflexively do something to invalidate himself as the offering. So he bids Abraham to bind him so he won't be able to move a muscle. And so, at this extraordinary juncture, at this almost incomprehensible event, what is the active role of Isaac himself? Nothing. Completely passive, indeed immobilized. And why is that so significant in the context of the narrative? This is, from my perspective, the most profound aspect of the story. Isaac comes into this world in the household of Abraham and Sarah, a household that was, more than anything else, characterized by active loving kindness. Abraham is the one who, after all, in the lead up to being told about the impending birth of Isaac, is running around while he's convalescing from his circumcision in order to provide for these vagabonds walking down the road. And indeed, the passage immediately preceding the story of the binding of Isaac tells us that Abraham planted a tamarisk tree and he was calling out in the name of God eternal. He was setting up an inn in order to be able to bestow kindness upon passers-by and teach them all about God. So, Isaac is growing up in this household. Obviously, Isaac sees his mission in life as being a chip off the old tree. He's going to strive to be the man of active loving kindness, just as his father. And active loving kindness means first and foremost to be active, to go out there and do, just as his father had done. And then he comes to Mount Moriah, the ultimate spiritual challenge in life. And what in fact is expected of him at that moment? To not move a muscle, to be absolutely passive and not active. Can you imagine the magnitude of that trauma? He's dedicated his entire life to being Abraham number 2. And when he gets to that ultimate test, there's an impervious, solid wall between him and being Abraham number 2. And to appreciate just how humongous that trauma is, I need to share with you a tradition that we have. And one of the verses that we read this morning, when we read in the conclusion of the punishment described in Leviticus chapter 26, that God says in chapter 26, verse 42, I will remember my covenant with Jacob and also my covenant with Isaac and also my covenant with Abraham I will remember and the land I will remember. So, how many covenants are listed in the verse? How many covenants? 4. How many times is remembering mentioned in the verse? Let me read it again. Pay attention. I will remember my covenant with Jacob and also my covenant with Isaac and also my covenant with Abraham I will remember and the land I will remember. How many rememberings? 3. Who's missing? Which remembering is absent? Isaac. It's, again, I remember my covenant of Jacob and also my covenant with Isaac and my covenant with Abraham I will remember and the land I will remember. And remembering is missing with respect to Isaac. So, we have a tradition. Why is there no remembering mentioned in this verse with respect to Isaac? Because Isaac is absolutely unforgettable. His ashes are heaped upon the altar. This is the way the answer is formulated in the Midrash. So Isaac is completely unforgettable. And inevitably, what? His ashes are heaped upon the altar? What are his ashes are heaped upon the altar? He didn't die. He wasn't burned. What does it mean? Isaac, number 1, never came down from the altar. the Isaac that came down from the altar was a completely changed person. Because, again, if his entire mission up until that point was to be Abraham number 2, he realizes at that transformative event in his life, God has said to him, I don't need an Abraham number 2. I already have Abraham number 1. I need Isaac number 1, and that's not Abraham number 2. So the old Isaac never comes down from the altar. His ashes are heaped there. And Isaac number 1, that is the real Isaac number 1, not the pseudo Isaac number 1, which was just Abraham number 2. The real Isaac is a completely different dynamism. His role is not to be the active, outgoing bearer of loving kindness. What attribute do we associate with Isaac? Well, the attribute that we associate with Isaac is one that is twice enunciated in Genesis chapter 31 by Jacob, when Jacob refers to God as having saved him from the clutches of Laban when he has his final decisive encounter with him. Were it not that the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac was with me, you have sent me empty-handed. The labor of my hands, the my impoverishment, the Lord saw and reproved last night. Fear of Isaac. And likewise, a few verses afterward, when Jacob takes an oath with Laban, Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. We read in verse 23. So what is this attribute of fear of Isaac? Obviously, it doesn't mean be petrified by fear, but it means the restraint, which is in some sense the counterpoint to the active Abraham. Isaac's role is a role that is predicated upon restraint and not the act of kindness. And it is epitomized by, as Isaac well appreciates it is epitomized by, his role at the binding, to be completely immobilized. And so we don't see Isaac as the active Abraham at all. Because Isaac had the wherewithal to appreciate that, having all his life envisioned his role as being to get over here, to be Abraham number 2, and having found instead, at the transformative moment in his life, at the binding, a solid impervious wall saying, that's not where you're going. Realize, that's not where I'm going because that's not who I really am. I need to go a different direction. Profound message altogether in dealing with the traumas and crises that inevitably befall us in life. And, parenthetically, precisely in that vein, we can, revisiting the blessings and Jacob's role, appreciate that in a different vein, the exact same thing happens with Jacob. Jacob begins life, growing up, after all, as son of Isaac, with the goal of being Isaac number 2. And that is why he is described explicitly, after all, as being a simple man who dwells in tents. A simple man who dwells in tents, that sounds just like Isaac. And that's what Jacob starts off his career thinking he's supposed to be. The homebody, keep it simple, complete dedication, no complexities. And then what happens? He's thrust into the whirlpool of having to deceive his father and then flee to Haran and to be in the employ of the greatest deceiver in the world, and to learn through this crucible of deceit what his unique attribute needs to be, the way he will blaze a new trail in coming to God. This is an idea that is implicit, at least, at the very end of the prophecy of Micah. When we read in chapter 7, verse 20, you give truth to Jacob and kindness to Abraham. The attribute of Jacob is truth, which in some sense is indeed a synthesis of thesis and antithesis of Abraham and Isaac. But there again, Jacob thought he had a mission to be Isaac number 2. And the moment that he is summoned to procure the blessing in the manner in which he did, again, he's aiming to get over here, and there's a solid wall that prevents him from getting there, and he realizes he needs to head in a different direction. That in fact, these traumas are what enabled Isaac and in turn Jacob to grow into themselves what they were summoned to be. And perhaps we need to see this as a crucially important lesson for each and every one of us, that often we think we're aiming to get somewhere, wherever that somewhere is, and that's going to be the answer to all of life's ills, and that's what we're summoned to be, and that's what we need to be, and that's everything. And then everything comes collapsing around us like a house of cards. And inevitably the question is going to be, what next? And there are those who may indeed end up, as a consequence, on the planks or on the ropes, choose your metaphor, completely bowled over by this experience of such incomprehensible trauma. It's traumatic. This was my life. What happened to my life? And the summons, the mission, is to recognize, no, I thought that was my life. I got it wrong. And it's precisely in this vein that we appreciate the message in Proverbs. 7 times the righteous man falls down and gets up, and the wicked stumbles in his wickedness. And when we consider just what that means, there's an idea that was actually enunciated by a rabbi in the last generation, that there are those who erroneously think that what the verse is saying is the righteous falls down 7 times, but nevertheless he gets up. Totally missing the point of the verse. The righteous is the one who has the dedication, the devotion, the perseverance to transform every fall into a new rising. The problem with the wicked is he falls down, and that's where he stays. Stumbles in his wickedness, and that's it. That's the end. The summons of the righteous is to be able to transform the fall into a basis for a new rising. To recognize that that circumstance that led me to fall is a God-given gift for me to be able to rise. Obviously, it's not easy. It is nothing if not traumatic, but that's what life is all about. And maybe to expand on this a little bit further, we have an idea in our tradition. This is not explicit in the Bible, but that for those whom God loves, he gives suffering. Called suffering out of love. What does it mean? Why would God give suffering to a person? And the way I like to express it, a crude analogy. Let's say you're in a room a completely sealed room with no doors or windows. And you know your mission is to get to the roof of the building. But you can't get to the roof of the building. You can't even get out of the room. It's just sealed. No doors, no windows, nothing. So what do? Well, many people just do nothing. But if you're a real climber, you'll look around the room and see maybe there's a chair or a table. I can just start climbing. I can't get to the roof. I can't even get out of the room. But I can at least try to get higher up in the room. I can aim to get as close as I can to the ceiling. So I aim for the ceiling and try to put together whatever furniture I could find in order to be able to climb and climb and climb until I get to the ceiling. And there are people who may lackadaisically, half-heartedly, see how far they can get in the direction of the ceiling, and that's all of life. But there are also people who are climbers, who are really striving to get as close as they can to the roof. So they keep on climbing and climbing and climbing until they get up to the ceiling. And you know what happens when they get to the ceiling? God bestows an extraordinary gift upon them. He smashes the ceiling in on their heads. And boy, is that painful. It's not just painful because, it's rather uncomfortable to have a ceiling bashed in on your head. It's more than that. It's traumatic because if you've been orienting your entire striving in life to reaching the ceiling, and now there's no more ceiling, that is profoundly disorienting. But if you're a real climber, then lying down there in the debris on the floor, you look up and you see through what used to be the ceiling, I can see the ceiling of the next floor up. And I can start climbing again. And climbing, not just to reach the first ceiling, to reach the second ceiling of the next floor up. And if you're a real climber, when you get near that ceiling, what'll happen? God will bash the ceiling in on your head again. And it'll be an even greater trauma because first of all, you'll be falling not just one floor down, you'll be falling 2 floors down. Second of all, again, that's what you've been orienting your entire striving to reach, to get to the ceiling, and no more ceiling. But lying on the floor amid the debris, you see there's another ceiling there. And you keep on climbing, and each time you reach the ceiling, God smashes it in on your head. He keeps on bestowing these gifts, gift after gift after gift. Boy, is it hurt. But you're growing towards Him. So the suffering out of love is a gift to enable us. It's not just a matter of enabling us to come closer to God. It's that too. It's enabling us to come closer to who we are. Because who we are is not just molded in the crucible of that suffering. It is uncovered by stripping away all these provisional ceilings that are really just crutches, means to a loftier and loftier and loftier end. Keep on growing, keep on going, keep on moving. What a gift. Terrifying gift, but what a gift. So we talked about the patriarchs. Maybe this is more urgent. When something like this happens, you always have to think, well, none of us chose this subject, but it kind of chose itself, so maybe God chose the subject, and we're just going along because, well, He showed us the way. He broke down the appropriate ceilings. But this is a really profound message that I think we all need to strive to integrate into our lives. I have something further to add, but yes. No, please, you continue. I'll put what I have to say in the end.
Well, I was just going to say, Isaac definitely went in a different direction. You don't hear from him again. He definitely didn't go back with Abraham to the other people. He disappears from the scene until he meets Rivka.
Okay, so well said. So I wasn't going to go into this, but since you mentioned it, this is, to my mind, unequivocally, the most terrifying verse in all of Genesis chapter 22. Because at the end of the story, what we read is, and Abraham went back to his youths, and they got up and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt in Beersheba. And the obvious question, what happened to Isaac? Where's Isaac? So I'll share with you two different midrashim, which are two sides of one coin here. One midrash tells us, where's Isaac? Isaac didn't go back after the episode of the binding of Isaac. He entered alive into the Garden of Eden. And if you ask, well, how long did he stay there? The answer is, well, he stayed there until it says he came out. Where does it say he came out? Well, after all, when Rebecca is coming back with Abraham's slave, so what we read, read the words very directly and very literally, this is in Genesis in chapter 24, in verse 63, and I quote, Vayetze Yitzchak, Isaac went out, Lasuach basadeh lifnot arev, to commune in the field before evening. In our tradition, Isaac was innovating afternoon prayers. And he lifted up his eyes and he saw that camels were coming. So he's in the Garden of Eden, because the Garden of Eden is a perceptive rather than creative realm. Isaac needs time to stew in this new attribute, the fear of Isaac, that is so transformative for him, that gives him his unique destiny in blazing a new trail to God. So he needs to be in this perceptive realm, out of this world, literally out of this world, in order to be able to cultivate this attribute. And when does he come back into the world? He comes back into the world again in order to pray and in order to get married. In other words, after the incubation period, it's time for him to return to this world, to resume his role in this world, but not the same role, in order to innovate something new. The reflective role of the afternoon prayers, which is specifically when you withdraw from whatever you were involved in doing during the day in order to stop and pray. The attribute of Isaac. And again, also to get married, because he and Rebecca together will have a role to play in continuing this mission that begins with Abraham and Sarah to the next generation. And again, that's the manner in which Isaac is internalizing, integrating this new mission that is bestowed upon him. So that's also a crucial aspect of, again, being transformed by the crisis and growing as a result into himself, into what God designated him to be. Does anyone else have anything to comment? Yes, please. I'm going to give you a shocking answer to that. And this is a thought enunciated by one of the great rabbis and philosophers of the last generation, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, passed away in 1992. And in one of the talks that he gave on the subject of repentance, actually, for the days of repentance, he made this comment that what we need to learn from the binding of Isaac, which of course is what we read on the second of the days of repentance in the Torah reading of the second day of Rosh Hashanah, story of the binding of Isaac. way he expressed it was, it's wrong to think that the Torah is opposed in principle to the principle of human sacrifice. Now, I need to add to that. He went on to say, of course, in practice, the Torah is categorically opposed to human sacrifice because human sacrifice necessarily entails either homicide or suicide. And both are categorically forbidden. But the idea in principle that a person should be prepared to give everything as an act of devotion, yeah, we believe that. That really is integral to appreciating the message of the Torah, to regard life itself as subordinate to something greater than life, the meaning in life. And perhaps the best way of illustrating that is with a principle that we associate in our tradition with two adjacent laws that are enunciated in Deuteronomy chapter 23. We read in verse 4 of the prohibition on an Ammonite or Moabite coming into the assembly of the Lord. That is, that an Ammonite or Moabite can never be accepted as a partner in marriage with a Jewish woman, as opposed to, with respect to the Edomites and the Egyptians, whom we are commanded not to abhor, such that the third generation can enter into the assembly of the Lord. Of course, everyone else can enter into the assembly of the Lord immediately. And the truth of the matter is that these laws are in the books, but they're impracticable because we recognize that these nations no longer exist in the original formulation that they had previously. But what's the idea here? What characterizes Ammon and Moab, and what characterizes the Egyptians? As a result, and as a result, there are the respective prohibitions that apply to them both. Well, Ammon and Moab are described in the narrative of the Torah of not greeting you with bread and water, and moreover, having hired Balaam, son of Beor, to curse you. And that hiring of Balaam, we also associate with something else that was described in the book of Numbers. And in some sense, the most critical aspect of Balaam's impact upon the nation of Israel. Recall that when God commands Moses to send forth the troops to do battle with Midian. And that's not an easy narrative to read, but that when they come back with all of the women of Midian, Moses says in Numbers chapter 31, in verse 16, these were the ones who were against the people of Israel by the word of Balaam to cause trespass against God in the matter of Peor that resulted in the plague smiting the people. In other words, summoning of Balaam ultimately, more than anything else, was means to causing the moral corruption, the degeneration of Israel, and that is the reason that Ammon and Moab are categorically off limits. The Egyptians were the ones who threw the babies in the Nile. Now, you'd think if you had to rate these two crimes, corrupting versus murdering, which is more severe, you might think that murder is a more severe crime. And the lesson that we learn in our tradition from the greater severity of the punishment that is meted out to Ammon and Moab, they're completely excluded, as opposed to the Egyptians who are allowed in after 3 generations, is it's worse to corrupt someone than to kill him. Because if you kill someone, you've only killed him in this world. If you corrupt someone, you've driven him out of this world and the next world. And the next world is everlasting life. It's forever. So why am I mentioning this? Because that means then that life in this world really means to something greater. So, apropos of the question with respect to human sacrifice, in principle, only in principle, I don't want anyone to walk away from here with any misunderstandings here. That would really be devastating. But in principle, the idea that you should be prepared to subordinate physical life in this world to spiritual life, to the hilt, makes perfect sense. The only thing is, again, it would entail either homicide or suicide, and both homicide and suicide are cardinal sins. So you don't do it. You don't do it. But there's a lesson in the binding of Isaac that teaches us a crucially important dimension in principle.
And it's about time to stop, but one thing I want to comment along that line of what he said, he didn't say this, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. And this is one of the problems with Christianity. A lot of the Jews think is better to have the Christians kill them than to pervert them spiritually or corrupt them.
That's why Jews prefer death to baptism. Yeah. And again, this has nothing to do with my respecting you as Christians.
I understand, but it's just like this.
You have your way with God, we have our way with God. We don't want to compromise that, obviously.
But that's why they're so opposed to proselytizing.
Well said. Maybe just as a final conclusion, what I do feel inevitably stems from what we said about growing into yourself, that constant growing. We encounter a turn of phrase with respect to the send-off that Jethro gives Moses when he's on his way back to Egypt. When he solicits from Jethro permission to go back and see his brethren in Egypt. So Jethro says in chapter 4 of Exodus, in verse 18, Lech le shalom. Translating literally, even though I suspect most translations won't be literal here, go toward peace. There is an ironic departure from that formula of go toward peace that we find when Absalom solicits from David his permission. To go to Hebron in the second book of Kings in chapter 15 in verse 9. David says to Absalom, Lech b'shalom. Literally translated, go in peace. Okay, so here's the message I want to share with you from our tradition. Whenever you take leave of someone, always say, Lech le shalom. Go toward peace. Never lech b'shalom. Of course, on a prosaic plate, I'll say, well, because Jethro said to Moses, go toward peace, and Moses had a pretty successful career afterward. David said to Absalom, go in peace, and well, that was about it for Absalom. He ended up hanged. But on a far more profound plane, what's the difference between go toward peace and go in peace? If you're in peace, you're resting in peace. People who are resting in peace, we bury. As long as you're alive in this world, never be in peace, only toward peace. Recognize that as long as you are alive, you got to keep on going, keep on growing, keep on moving, because that's precisely what life is all about. When God tells Zechariah to convey the blessing to Joshua the high priest, this is in Zechariah in chapter 3, in verse 7. The blessing is, So says the God of hosts, if you go in my way and you keep my watch and you judge my house and you watch my courtyards, in the Hebrew, "V'natati lecha mehalchim ben ha'omedim ha'eleh." Translating literally, I will give you walkers among these standing ones. Walkers, standing ones, what is it talking about? Man is the walker. Man is always the walker. Because human beings come into this world as physical beings endowed with a latent spiritual potential. And what life is all about is the actualization of that spiritual potential. As for the standing ones are the angels. We read in Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 7, their legs were straight legs. In verse 9, they didn't turn as they went. The angels are static. They are created as spiritual beings, and so they remain. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the beast is a physical being, and so it remains. One of our commentators from around 500 years ago explains the Hebrew word for beast, behema, as a contraction of ba-ma. Whatever it is already inside. Man, uniquely, is the being who's constantly actualizing a potential, a latent potential. And to that extent, the wish that we always give to one another when we part is lech le shalom, never lech be shalom. Go toward, but keep on going, keep on growing, keep on moving upward. The only time we ever take leave of a person with lech be shalom is when he's being buried. Because in Genesis chapter 15, God says to Abraham, you will be gathered to your ancestors in peace, be shalom, and be buried in a good old age. Because when someone leaves this world, there's no going and growing and moving left. So we pray that he's come to peace and that he'll be able to rest in peace. But as long as you're alive, never rest. Never be in peace. Only toward peace. And I realize we need to, I guess, part ways now because the time is up. And I want to say this to you, not chas v'chalila, not God forbid as goodbye, but for the time being at least, keep on trucking. Le shalom. Keep on going, keep on growing, keep on moving. And God willing, we'll see one another in Jerusalem in October.
Yeah. Let's give him a big hand. Thank you. Amen. Thank you, Chaim. We appreciate everything.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you, Pastor Mark, and thank you, each of you. Right, yeah, the books are over there, and there's also various other paraphernalia that's free. Please take the brochure about the ministry and the article and the contact information. Please. The more you take, the fewer I have to lug around with me. So if you have anyone else who might be interested, by all means, please take it. Well, I'm not going to waste them, but I would be very happy if people could take them.
Oh, this is great.
So we didn't get to Mishpatim, but